must be something. What have I done wrong?
Nothing?
Valerie, when nothing is wrong, you say nothing in a regular voice. When something is wrong, you say nothing. Now, what's wrong?
Nothing.
If nothing is wrong, why are you cleaning the bureau at 2 o'clock in the morning?
It's dirty.
Will you stop that? I want to talk to you. Relax, will you? Relax. You know what's going to happen if you keep this up? You're not going to be able to sleep tonight.
I'll sleep very well, thank you.
No, you won't sleep very well, thank you. You're keeping things bottled up inside of you. You never sleep well when you keep things inside of you.
I will sleep like a little baby.
Then let's go to sleep. Valerie, do you call that sleep?
Don't you touch me.
Will you
Don't
please...
you ever touch me.
What's wrong?
Nothing.
You're trying to tell me that nothing is wrong when you're lying there like a cardboard figure staring at the ceiling? Are you comfortable that way?
Yes.
Will you at least face me?
No.
You won't talk to me, you won't let me touch you, and now you won't even look at me. Is that what you want?
Yes, I like it this way.
Well, okay, you got it that way. That's it. Have it. Good night.
Go ahead, get moody. That's what you want, isn't it? You want to play games, don't you?
Oh.
Well, I'm not going to play your game. Just because I won't talk to you is no reason for you not to talk to me. I mean, I know I'm not telling you what's bothering me, but for the life of me, I can't understand why you can't read between the lines.
Read between the lines?
Yes.
You haven't said anything for me to read between. Well, you really are something, you know, that I've been trying to find out all night what's wrong with you. Soon as I clam up, you want to talk. All right. What's wrong?
Nothing. Well, I don't mean nothing in the sense of meaning nothing. I mean, I was just saying nothing as a figure of speech, that's all. I mean, I was saying nothing just to save you a lot of anguish. That's what I was doing. Oh, I feel so much better now. It's so good for me to get it off my chest. Oh, don't you feel better, Alan? Alan? Alan, what's wrong?
Nothing.
Well, we're really going to solve a lot with you having that attitude.
That attitude? You talk to me about my attitude? Oh, I've tried so hard. I've tried so hard to make this marriage work. Oh, darn it. Oh.
Alan.
Don't touch me.
Alan.
Please go away. I don't want you to see me this way.
See you this way, Alan. I see you every which way, and I love you, Alan. I do. Let's go, Alan. Please snap out of this silly mood and let's go to bed.
No.
Alan.
I'm not tired. Oh.
Alan.
What?
Let Mommy see what's under the pajama top.
No, don't do that. Don't do it. You know I hate that. Come on, you know I hate that. Come on,
love
son.
that sweet little chest
No,
of yours.
please, go away. Don't.
Oh, there it is. I love him.
Oh, and I love her. Oh, darling.
Oh, let's go to bed.
Yeah. Honey, you know, it really does feel good to get it all out of your system.
Of course it does. I mean, isn't it awful, people who can't air their differences? I mean, talking things out like this, like we do, darling, is so healthy for our marriage.
I know. You know, I even forgot what the whole argument was about. What did I do wrong?
Nothing.
Hey, my dad was a pretty good forgiver. I should know because I was a pretty good or bad offender. I want two incidents from my teen years that happened pretty much back to back, a couple of months in a row. Kind of let me know, learn some things about this subject of forgiveness. The year was 1973 or 1974. I forget if I was a sophomore or a junior in high school. And it was December, late December, and there was a New Year's Eve party coming up on New Year's Eve, obviously. And I happened to know where a convenience store was that a certain clerk would sell me anything I wanted alcohol-wise. And so we drove my 1965 yellow convertible Volkswagen in front of the then King Quick store and parked and waited in the parking lot because there were other customers were in there. And it would have been suspicious if two 16 or 17-year-old boys would have come in and purchased what we were about to purchase, so we waited. So while we were waiting, my friend in the car with me, Mike, he reached into my glove compartment and he pulled out the gun that I had in there. Now, before you jump to any conclusions that I might have led you into, it was the frame of a blank gun. So you got to picture this. It was just a metal frame. It didn't have a cylinder in it where the blanks would have gone. It didn't have a hammer or a trigger. Didn't even have the plastic on the handles. It was just the frame of a blank gun. And he got that out, and he was twirling it on his finger like this, you know, and we're waiting for the last customers to come out. And I said, okay, let's go in. So he puts it back into the glove compartment. We go in, we make our purchase, and we come out. There's a policeman standing there. And so my friend came out first. He got in the car, and when I came out, the policeman, here I am, and I have a brown paper bag holding it with 2 bottles in it. And he said, "Son, do you have a gun in your car?" And I went, "I'm going to get away with this." That was my first thought. And I said, "Well, I've got the frame of a blank gun." He said, "Well, let me see it." I said, "Okay." So I go over to the car and I said, "Mike, hide this stuff." So the back seat of a Volkswagen comes up, and so he stuffed the stuff in there. And I got that out, and the policeman was looking at it and asking me questions. And another cruiser pulls up, you know, and so they're asking me all kinds of questions about this frame of a blank gun. And obviously, we did not rob the store. And eventually, he says, "Was that beer you bought?" And I said, "No, sir." He said, because I can't remember, there was 2 quarts of Colt 45 and there was 2/5 of screwdriver. So I don't know which one that I bought. But I might have told the truth or I might have lied. Doesn't matter. And when he said, "Was that beer you bought?" I said, "No, sir." And he said, "Well, let's take a look." So I go over to the car and I said, "Mike, get the beer out. You know, like, we're going to get away with something out of this. You know, it's not a totally wasted experience." So he got the beer out, and then he gets us out of the car, and then the other policeman checked the car, and he comes out with, you know, the other 2 bottles, and he let some expletive deleted come out, you know, like, oh, whatever. And so anyway, we got busted. So they take us downtown, call our police, our parents, and they pretty much determined if our parents were going to lower the boom on us, which both parents would and did, that they weren't going to do a whole lot. So I was grounded the entire month of January, including New Year's Eve, and the entire month of January. So my dad dealt with it, and then it was over with, except for my discipline that I had to endure. So February rolls around, first Friday night of freedom. I'm out driving around, my best friend Mike again and another guy, and we stop at another store, and I pick out a 6-pack and beer, and we're out driving around, have an open container in my car, and get pulled over. So anyway, long story short, grounded for the entire month of February. So it was back to back. Now here's the thing. My dad dealt with the first offense, and then even when I was grounded the entire month, he didn't keep grinding it in. He didn't keep reminding me. And even when I got free, he didn't say, don't go out and do it again, even though I went out and did it again. And when I went out and did it again, he didn't say, "There you go again." And I didn't really appreciate the gift that he was giving me until much later in life. When I began to think, you know, that's a pretty good picture of forgiveness. There's an offense, it's dealt with, there's forgiveness, and there's consequences, because forgiveness doesn't always remove consequences, and then you move on, and as if the first offense didn't happen in the first place. So that's the power of forgiveness. Somebody a long time ago shared with me that forgiveness is not a feast. And I don't know where they got it. I tried to look it up because there's an acronym that I'm going to give you here. And I remembered most of it. Some of this might be my own rendition of FEAST. And I want to give you something that might help you to remember. First of all, forgiveness is not fun. True forgiveness is not fun because it makes us face the full reality of our hurt and our pain and the offense. To not face it is to not really give forgiveness. It's just trying to sweep it under the rug and act like everything's okay. So forgiveness is not fun. Forgiveness is not easy. Forgiveness is not easy. True, genuine forgiveness is one of the hardest things you might ever do in your life, especially depending on the offense or offenses that need to be forgiven. Forgiveness is not automatic. It doesn't just happen. Time heals all wounds. Not true. Time heals no wounds. Even in your body, time does not heal the wounds of your bodies, the natural things that have been built into our body, that immune system, with healing, whatever, the white blood cells, whatever. That's what heals the body, and it takes time, but it's not time that does it. And forgiveness is not saying, oh, it doesn't matter. Let's just let bygones be bygones. No, it's not, and you're going to see this, and what you're going to see all of this when in the story we're going to look at this morning. And forgiveness is not trusting. Forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. You can forgive somebody and still not trust them. In fact, it may not be wise to trust them. And what's that based on? That's based upon their behavior. And so the rule of thumb is always trust that which proves to be trustworthy. Never trust that which proves to be untrustworthy. So there's that old saying, fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice. Well, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. I need to learn. I like what a professor that I had in seminary said, look at the signs on the front of the bus and see where that bus is going. And here's what I like to say. Don't believe people's words, believe their actions. That's what's going to show you whether they're trustworthy or not. Not what they say, not what they promise, but what they actually end up doing. So we've been looking at the family chronicles of one family that covers 4 generations in the book of Genesis. We haven't gone into a lot of detail with like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but we've been looking at the story of Joseph. This was the family that God said, I'm going to bless you to Abraham. I'm going to make your name great. Your descendants are going to be as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I'm going to bless you, and you are going to be a blessing to the entire world. And so that started with Abraham. And so Joseph was his great-grandson. And in that family, if you recall, just by way of review, there was some lying, deceit, there was some murder plots, there was just outright dysfunction, there was polygamy, there was, lots of kinds of things going on that are right out of the modern family, right out of the Jerry Springer show, that were true then, that are true now. And here's one of the encouraging things. God didn't give up on them. God loved them. God was at work in their midst to heal and overcome the dysfunction and then that's the modern term, the sinful patterns that were present in those families. And he loves us, and he's at work in our lives as well. Last week we talked about winning the family feud, pretty much by not proving you were right, but by forgiving those who have hurt you. We really win by forgiving. And some people don't see forgiveness that way. Some people see forgiveness as a sign of weakness. Really, forgiveness is a sign of strength because it takes a lot to be able to genuinely forgive. And so this week we're going to dig a little bit deeper with this message that I'm calling Ending the Family Feud. So let me give it a review. So all of our previous content is available on our Spring Hills Worship YouTube page. You can look those up. Those messages that have been a part of this series are there, or on the Spring Hills website as well. So the account of Joseph starts in Genesis 37. It skips chapter 38, and then it goes from 39 to the end of Genesis, which is 50. So there's a lot of material there. And we're trying to cover those 13 chapters or so in 2 weeks because there's some highlights that are extremely important for us today. So this is way more than a biblical history lesson. This is some ideas that we need to get a hold of that are going to help us, because there's not a person in this room that has never been hurt or offended. There's not a person in this room that has never been hurt or offended. And by the way, there's not a person in this room that's never hurt or offended somebody else. So it kind of goes both ways. So this is that hurt, that offense that we may carry. Some people carry it for a few hours, a few days, a few weeks, a few months, a few years, a few decades. I've known people that have carried hurts 50 plus years of their life and who were living in denial. No, I'm not hurt, I'm not angry. And only to come to find out how angry they really were. So Joseph, let's just review. Joseph is the great-grandson of Abraham. His dad is by the name of Jacob. Jacob has another name that he goes by in Scripture. It's called Israel. So Israel is the guy who the nation of Israel was named after. And he had 12 sons and a daughter by the name of Dinah, by the way, for biblical trivia there. Anyway, Joseph was the second youngest of the 12 brothers. He had a younger brother by the name of Benjamin, and they both had the same mom. There's like sister wives going on here with Jacob. He had 4 wives, and one of his wives was his favorite, and the 2 children born from her in that relationship were his 2 favorite children. So he's got 4 wives, 13 children, and he plays favorites, not only with his wives, but also with his sons, which created a lot of sibling rivalry within that family. And it says that his brothers, speaking of Joseph, could not even speak a kind word to him. There's like the nitpicking and the hurt and the anger and the hatred. And it was magnified by the fact that Joseph had 2 dreams. Now, these dreams, it turned out to be more than just the pizza that he ate the night before or whatever. These dreams were kind of prophetic. These dreams were God revealing something about his future. And we know that because we know the end of the story, if you've read the end of the story. So anyway, these dreams were about his family, his brothers, his mom, his dad, everybody bowing down to him. And his brothers just hated him all the more because of that. No, you're not going to rule over us. And so on an opportunity that they had when Joseph came to check on them, when they're out tending the flocks in the kind of a couple days journey away, Dad says, go check on him. They said, here comes this dreamer. And so they plotted to kill him. And they threw him in a dry well, some kind of pit. And instead of killing him, when a caravan came by that's headed down with their goods to Egypt for trading, they sold him in the human trafficking slave market. So here's their youngest brother. He's pleading with them. And they're just hard-hearted. They don't care about hurting him. They don't care about what this is going to do to dear old dad back home. And they perpetuate this lie that they take this garment that their dad had made for Joseph and they ripped it up a little bit and they killed an animal and they dipped it in the blood and they go back and they don't overtly lie. They bring this back and they say, is this Joseph's coat? And they let Dad make his own conclusions. So I'm sure that's how they soothed their guilty conscience a little bit. We didn't lie. We didn't tell Dad that Joseph died we just let him come to his own conclusion. And so there's that bereavement, that grief that Dad's experiencing. And then, so Joseph goes down to Egypt and he gets put on the auction block and he's bought by the man by the name of Potiphar, who is captain of Pharaoh's guard. And Joseph, true to form, because he has this gift and these abilities, he gets in there and he starts serving and he does everything well. And he gets put in charge of Potiphar's house, kind of like the business manager. And everything is going really well. Except for Potiphar's wife takes a liking to Joseph and says, come to bed with me, and kept trying to seduce him. And he even said, how could I do this great evil and sin against God and sin against my master? I'm not going to do this. Well, day after day, she kept saying, come lie with me. And one day, when everybody else was out of the house, she grabbed him, his coat, and tried to pull him into the bedroom perhaps. And he spun out of that. I don't know what it looked like. And he ran out of the house. And then she was a woman spurned. And so she accused Joseph of trying to rape her. So then he's thrown into prison where he spends the next couple of years. So he gets sold as a slave when he's 17. And he's in prison. He gets out of prison when he's 30. So look, just think, 17 to 30. The years that somebody would, in our society, go to college, graduate, maybe go to grad school, maybe not, get a job, get married, start a family. Those years, those prime time years of life have been significantly altered because of the sinful, angry, hurtful choices of some other individuals. Can you relate to that? Maybe not 13 years, maybe it was 5 years, maybe whatever. Maybe it was a longer period of time. And you're living with the consequences of a divorce, or the consequences of rejection, or the consequences of being unjustly fired, whatever. Living with the consequences of that. Well, I like what Joseph does. Obviously, these dreams about him being in charge are part of a gift of, we might call it leadership or administration, because wherever he goes, just like in Potiphar's house, he starts serving. He doesn't throw a pity party. I'm sure this was not an easy thing to adjust to, but we see him serving and blessing people because he had a clear sense of what God's purpose for his family was. God had told Abraham, I'm going to bless you and I want you to be a blessing to the entire world. And so Joseph took that seriously. I'm going to bless Potiphar by serving him. Even in the worst of circumstances, I am going to bless the people around me rather than mope and gripe and complain and have that pity party. I am going to bless them because that is part of my family heritage. That's God's will for my family, to bless the entire world. And while a lot of his family did not take that seriously, he did. And then so he gets thrown into prison. And guess what? He does it again. He starts serving, so much so that the captain of the prison guard saw this and put him in charge of all the other prisoners. And then, so what happens providentially, two of Pharaoh's servants, the cupbearer and the baker, I think I said butler last week, but the baker, they offend Pharaoh and they get thrown into prison, and there they are. And so guess who's attending to them? Joseph. So one night, on the same night, they both have a dream. And they kind of believe there might be some meaning to this dream, and Joseph comes by and says, well, what's the matter? What's going on? He said, we had dreams and we don't understand it. And he said, well, the interpretation of dreams really belongs to God. And so tell me your dream. So they tell him the dream. So the cupbearer starts first, and Joseph says, this is what your dream means. In a couple of days, you're going to be restored back to your position with Pharaoh. And so, yay, good for you. And so the baker goes, wow, that's a good outcome. Here's my dream. And Joseph might have said, boy, I don't know what he said. I'm sorry, I got bad news. In 3 days, you're going to be put to death. And guess what happens? Both of those things come to pass. So when the cupbearer is leaving, Joseph says, please remember me. I've done nothing wrong. I don't deserve to be here. But the cupbearer forgot all about Joseph. And so time goes by. 2 years, as a matter of fact. And Pharaoh has 2 dreams. And these dreams were all about 7 years. Joseph interprets them, so I'm just fast forwarding to the interpretation. 7 years. There's going to be 7 years of abundance. The crops are going to overflow. And there's going to be followed by 7 years of famine. So Pharaoh has these dreams, and he's troubled. He doesn't know what they mean. And so the cupbearer speaks up and says, excuse me, my lord. He hates to bring up his previous offense. But you remember when you had me thrown into prison? When I was there, I had a dream, and there was a guy down there that told me the interpretation of the dream, and it came about just like he said. So Pharaoh says, bring this young man to me. And so they have to clean him up, they shave him, they make him look more presentable because he's been in a dungeon and probably hadn't showered in years. I don't know. So anyway, they bring him to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says, well, I hear you have the ability to interpret dreams. I love this, what Joseph says. He says, I don't have the ability, but God does. God will give you God will give you. Now keep in mind, he's in what a lot of people might consider to be a pagan country, where they had a plurality of gods. Pharaoh himself was considered to be a god. And so when Joseph said, God will give you, he used not just, we think of the word God as a very generic term. That word God in Hebrew is Elohim, and it's the God of the Hebrews. Elohim will give you the interpretation that you're looking for. And so he tells them, he says there's going to be 7 years of famine, plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. And if I were you, I'd appoint somebody to collect, 20% of the abundance and have it stored up. And so Pharaoh says, hey, is there anybody as wise as Joseph on all the land? And he puts him in charge of that. So Joseph goes from being in prison to being the second most powerful, influential man in Egypt overnight. So time goes by and Joseph gets married, and this is where we ended last week. He had 2 children. The first one he named Manasseh. Manasseh means it's because God has enabled me to forgive. God has enabled me to forgive. And the second son was Ephraim, and it says, and this is the meaning of both of these words, both of these names. God has enabled me to forgive, and God has blessed me in the land of my affliction. And we ended last week by saying that's the order that it always happens. And so when we hold on to anger, bitterness, when we hold on to a grudge, we are actually robbing ourselves of blessings that would come to us otherwise. Because Ephraim always follows Manasseh. It always works that way. And so that's where we ended up last week. So pick up here. So the question is, what goes into being able to forgive? Because forgiveness isn't easy, and it's not automatic. And forgiveness isn't saying, oh, let's let bygones be bygones. So there's some things. The meaning of the name Manasseh tells us that we need God's help. We need God's help. To truly forgive, we need a power greater than ourselves. I always picture the space shuttle blasting off, it's attached, or any kind of rocket, it's attached to the booster rocket, and it's the power of the booster that enables that rocket to break free from Earth's gravitational pull. And unforgiveness, hurt, heartache in us has a gravitational pull. It wants to stay there. In fact, we looked at this a little bit last week in Hebrews. It talks about a root of bitterness. So not only does it want to just stay there, it sinks down roots into the soil of our heart, and it just grips us. And not only does it not want to move, it wants to stay, and roots, what do roots do? Roots always spring up and produce shoots, and it wants to do its damage. And that's what we can deal with. That's why forgiveness is not easy. Because there's a power that's greater than us that is working against us, and we need a power that's greater than the hurt, the heartache, and that'll help us be set free from us. Luke 17:6, you can maybe jot this down. This is spoken in the context of forgiving others. Keep that in mind. Maybe you've heard this verse or are familiar with it. Jesus said, when he talked about forgiving over and over and over again, and his disciples said, increase our faith, which I always interpret to mean, Jesus, if you want me to forgive like that, you better give me greater faith. And this is where Jesus said, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you could say to this mulberry tree, be uprooted and cast into the sea, and it will obey you. So what's Jesus saying? It takes faith. It doesn't take great faith. It takes, because it's not faith that does it. It's somebody else that does it, and faith attaches us to that somebody else, which is God. Makes sense? So it takes God's help. It's also understanding God's justice. And I think Joseph had a clear understanding of God's justice, and we need to have a clear understanding of God's justice. And God's justice looks like this. Romans 12:19, you jot that down. Do not take revenge, my dear friends. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge. I will repay, says the Lord. So there's a sense of justice there. And when we're hurt and when we're offended, there's our sense of justice, our sense of right and wrong has been alerted. There's a warning that has gone off, that we know something's not right. And anger can tell us that, at least initially. And there's something that's not right here. Now look at what this says. Do not take revenge. And by the way, you got to understand, unforgiveness is the same as wanting to take revenge, whether you ever actually take revenge or not. Unforgiveness means I want this person to suffer for what they did. And unforgiveness means I think I have the right to make that person suffer for what they did. And I might not do something directly to that person. I just might talk about them. I just might tell others about them. I just, want the bird of paradise to fly up their nose. I just want the fleas of 1,000 camels to infest their armpits. And if I found out that they were, killed in a lightning strike, I would rejoice instead of be sad. That's that sense of justice. And justice is not a bad thing. You follow me on this. And so look at what God says. It is mine. I always picture a preschooler saying, mine. But this is not a preschooler. God is saying, this belongs to me. This is my exclusive right. In other words, it's not yours. It's mine. And then what does he promise? I will. He doesn't say, I might. I'll roll the dice and 5 out of 10 times I will. He says, I will. I will. I will take care of it. So look, that starts off by saying, leave room for God's wrath. Now that's kind of like, I don't know what you picture when you picture God's wrath, but here he's just talking about payback here, which is justice. So leave room. Do you know what that means? When I'm trying to take revenge, i.e., when I'm living in a state of unforgiveness, I'm squeezing out God's justice. That's why Paul wrote, leave room, make room, get out of the way. Get out of the way and let God do what needs to be done. So we have this, in Romans 14:12, he said a little bit later, so that each of us will give an account of ourselves to God, each one of us. Now sometimes people will say, what about an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth? Well, I'm glad you asked. Because if you go back and look up that passage about an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, you'll see that these were instructions that were given to the courts, the judges of the court system of that day. And what somebody who was offended would do was that they would take their case to the court, to the judges. They would not become a vigilante justice seeker. They gave it to the judge and let the judge. And actually, it was actually very fair. I could not be put to death for knocking out your tooth. It was life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. So it was a very fair sense of justice. The punishment had to fit the crime. It could not be excessive. And it was the courts, the judges, that dealt with that, not the individuals. So, now, I'm going to jump around with Joseph here. So at the end of the story, in Genesis chapter 15, now you know what happens. I don't know, if you're not familiar with the story, read Genesis 37 to 50 this week. So there's this time of plenty, and then there's followed by the years of famine. So during the years of famine, his brothers actually came down to Egypt to buy grain. And guess who they had to buy it from? Except they don't recognize him because he looks very Egyptian. He speaks Egyptian. And he hides his true identity from them initially while they're there. And there's reasons for that. So anyway, after he reveals himself, I'm kind of jumping around to the end here to make this point. They're all living in Egypt and their dad dies. And their brothers all of a sudden think, maybe the only reason he hasn't paid us back is out of respect for dear old dad. And now that dad's gone, maybe the boom is going to be lowered on us. So this is Genesis 50, starting at verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? See, they're fearing his judgment. And obviously he's in a position to do it. So they sent word to Joseph saying, your father left these instructions before he died. We don't know whether he really did or not, or maybe they're just saying it, kind of using that as leverage. This is what you're to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father. When their message came to him, they didn't even come themselves. They sent this by way of a messenger. When their message came to him, Joseph wept. And then his brothers came and threw themselves down before him. Again, there's that dream. We are your slaves, they said. In other words, please don't kill us. We're your slaves. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. And I love this question. This is so insightful and so informative to us when it comes to this sense of forgiveness, this whole idea of forgiveness. He asks this question, am I in the place of God? Guys, you're coming to me asking for forgiveness. I recognize it's not even my right to hold this against you. Only God has that right. I'm not God. And then I like what he says. You intended to harm me. In other words, this is not let's let bygones be bygones kind of a statement. I know you intended to harm me. But God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. By the way, that's one of the ways you'll know that you've forgiven is that you're willing to be a blessing. You're willing to provide. You're willing to care for. You're willing to be that blessing. So there's God's justice. It's God's place. Not ours. It's not ours. Because holding on to unforgiveness is like drinking poison, hoping the other person's going to die. It kills the person spiritually, mentally, emotionally. There's all kinds of things that it does to us when we hold on to that. But then there's God's help, God's justice, God's mercy. God's mercy. We looked at this verse a couple weeks ago. It's Ephesians 4:31-32. Paul wrote this to followers of Christ. Get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger. These are all anger-related words. Brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. So God's merciful to us. God is merciful. And God says, I want you to extend that same mercy to others that have hurt you. So God's mercy. So what did God do to prove that he would forgive? He sent his only begotten Son. And in Colossians it says, Paul wrote this in Colossians 2:13-14. He, God, forgave us all our sins, having canceled the charge of our legal indebtedness, which stood against us and has condemned us. He has taken it away, nailing it to the cross. He took it out of the way. So there's one more thing that's required, and it's our willingness. Our willingness. We've got to be willing, or you could add our obedience. Because sometimes we might need to pray, God, I don't want to, but I know I got to. I don't want to, but I know that I need to. And I need your help to even want to. And if I'm willing, and if I'm plugging into God's power, that's like the two prongs of a electrical cord that goes into the outlet. You remove either one of those, and there's no power that flows. You put both of them into the outlet, and the power will flow. And what we need is God's help, and what we need is our willingness. God's help and our willingness. God, this is too much for me. I don't even want to. There's this root of bitterness that has grown deep in me. It needs to be uprooted out of my heart. It needs to be cast into the sea of forgiveness. And I can't do that, but you can, and I need you. So, let's talk about forgiveness and trust real quick. Because that's an important issue. And we see this unfold in this story. So let's back up. Joseph's brothers go down to Egypt to buy grain because the famine is severe in all that part of the world. So they go down there, and he recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. So the first, it feels like he's toying with them at first. He says, you're all spies. You're coming to see where our land is weak and unprotected. And they said, no, we are 12 sons of one father, and one is no more. I love the irony of that statement, Because they say to Joseph, one is no more. And Joseph had to go in his heart, because he's speaking Egyptian to them, and he's talking to them through an interpreter. They still don't know who he is. One of them is no more. Kind of like, yeah, I know, that's me. But I got news for you, busters. One is no more. We're not spies. So he has them all thrown in jail for 3 days. Then he comes back and says, look, this is what I'm going to do. To prove that you're not spies, I'm going to keep one of you here in prison. The rest of you can go back. And you said you have a younger brother? You can't come back and buy grain unless you bring your younger brother. Now, this is a test. This is a test. Because they could have faked. They could have got one of their servants and substituted him in Benjamin's place and come back and say, this is our younger brother. Of course, Joseph would have known. So he's testing them to see if they can be trusted, to see if they have changed. Because sin that is harbored in our hearts over time will either harden our hearts, or God, if we let it, God will use it to soften our hearts so that I don't want to continue to live that way. And that happens to be the case for them. So, after time, one's in prison, the rest of them go back, and then they end up having to buy more grain, so they go back. And this time they have Benjamin with them. And so Joseph institutes another test. So when it's time for them to leave, he puts all their money back into their grain sacks that they brought to buy, and he puts a silver chalice in Benjamin's sack of grain. And then they're all headed out of town, and Joseph says to his servants, I want you to go after them. One of them has stolen something from me, and I want you to bring them back. So they come back. And so Joseph says, one of you has stolen something from me. And they say, oh, no, your servants, we would never do that. Let the one who has done, somebody speaks up, one of the brothers, let the one who has done it be put to death. Okay. So they check all their sacks of grain, and there in Benjamin's sack is that silver chalice. And so Joseph says, he'll be kept here in prison as my slave. The rest of you can go free. Judah speaks up. Judah. In the family lineage, Jesus is descended from Judah. That's why he's called the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Judah speaks up and says, oh, please let me speak. Don't be offended. I promised our father that I would bring Benjamin back. I cannot bear to go back and see my father's distress. If Benjamin, please let me bear his blame. Put me in prison and let Benjamin go free. Now, folks, right there you have a pretty good picture of Christ's substitutionary sacrifice for us. Now, it's obviously way different, but it's kind of a picture of it. Because Jesus bore our shame, our guilt, our sin, our blame before our Father so that we wouldn't have to. He substituted himself in our place. And so Joseph reveals himself to them. He realizes these guys have changed. They're not the same. They're not the same as when they sold me. They're different. So he reveals himself to them, and there's this kind of at first scary family reunion. If I was those 10 brothers, I would be a little bit scared because he has the power to imprison us, and we remember what he did. So back to the end, this is in Genesis 45. Joseph is talking to his brothers, and now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land. For the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. Joseph clearly had an understanding that God sent him to Egypt. Now, I don't think, and I know this, God did not intend for his brothers to sell him as a slave. It was God's plan for Joseph to end up in Egypt in that position. His brothers acted, because God does not prompt people to sin, but God used it. Remember a couple weeks ago we talked about God has something bigger than a plan for our life. He has a purpose. And the purpose stays, even when the plan is now working on plan B, C, D, E, F, G. Right? God will always circle back around to the purpose, and He will always trump the sinful choices of others to work out His purpose in our life, even if they've done what his brothers did to him. Joseph had a clear sense of that. Joseph knew who was in charge, and it wasn't him. I'm not in the place of God. In Joseph and Jesus, God took what was meant for evil and turned it into good. Right? The cross of Jesus Christ. What could be more evil than crucifying God in human flesh, the very Son of God? What could be more evil? It even says that Satan put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot to betray Jesus. Satan had a hand in that. And yet God trumped it through the resurrection. God used it to accomplish our salvation. And because God has a way of trumping anything the evil one will do. God has a way of trumping, even if it's not like from the evil one, even when there's a death, even when there's other tragic things that happen in our lives, God is more powerful than our circumstances. God is more powerful than what happens to us. God is more powerful than that root of bitterness that lives within. God is more powerful than our circumstances. And God's purpose stays. Even if a spouse has died, even if there's been a divorce, even if we've blown it by our choices, God's purpose remained for Joseph's brothers, even though they blew it big time. His purpose remained for them. And they finally got back in touch with it. They had some amends to be making. Right? They had some amends to be making. So let me talk real quick. Because I told you I was going to do this last week. The parallels between Joseph and Jesus. Both knew their purpose. Both were rejected by men, by people close to them. Both suffered. Both were humbled before they were exalted. Both provided for those who originally rejected them. Joseph loved his enemies. Jesus said, love your enemies. Do good to those who hurt you. He said, it's like heaping coals of fire on their head. Both provided for those who originally rejected them, and both were very careful to glorify God. Joseph never took credit for his gift of interpretation of dreams. He always gave God credit. We see that time and again throughout his story. So let me ask you this as we wrap up. Who do you need to forgive? Is it one, two, more people? Let me ask you this. Who are you trusting that you shouldn't? If some people came to mind, let me invite you to the Boundaries experience next Sunday night. That'll start. That'll make a whole lot more sense. In fact, next Sunday's message will help clarify that issue, make it as plain as night and day. Who are you not trusting that perhaps you now should? By the way, if you haven't forgiven, you won't trust, even if they're trustworthy. Who are you not trusting that perhaps that you now should forgive and begin to learn to trust? And let me ask you this, most importantly of all, are you personally accepting Jesus as your substitute? Are you accepting Him as the one that bears your blame before God? Are you accepting His substitutionary sacrifice on the cross for your offenses, for what you've done? Are we doing that? Because He bore our blame before the Father so that we wouldn't have to. Let's pray.